cloud tops, which shows the deeper convection with our hurricane. Now, yeah, Fran is a hurricane also, packing winds of about 80 to 90 miles an hour, and still some deep convection, although the deep convection is not totally circulating around the center. We have the deepest convection on the east and south side of the center right about here, and that puts it at about 23.4 degrees north, 66 degrees west. Again, 715 miles east-southeast of Nassau, Bahamas, with winds of 80 miles an hour. It is moving to the west-northwest at 10, and the lowest pressure we could find 979 millibars with Hurricane Fran. We'll continue to watch Fran for you as we go through the day today, and of course this entire week perhaps we'll be dealing with Fran, as it will be on Wednesday and Thursday as it gets closer and closer to the Bahamas, and then we don't know where it's going to go after that. So big interest here with Fran once we get Edouard out of the picture. We do have something else to tell you about as we're watching storms. Got some very messy conditions currently across southern New England, and one of the hardest hit spots, at least so far, feeling the brunt of this hurricane has been around the Chatham, Massachusetts area. These are scenes that we shot from last night, showing the winds howling along Cape Cod. At the elbow of Cape Cod, this is right around Chatham, Massachusetts, which is around the elbow. They've had the assault of the strong winds overnight. High tide, too, has been reported about 3 o'clock this morning, and the winds really helped to push some high water levels across the north-facing beaches. And right in the midst of all that nasty weather is our very own Bill Keneally. He's live right now in Chatham, Massachusetts. Bill, can you give us an idea about the latest conditions right now around Cape Cod?
I sure can, Cheryl. It's very, very windy out here. I'm guessing winds are from the north now, gusting maybe 55 to possibly as high as 60 miles per hour. The rain has abated somewhat. It's not near as heavy as it was on our shot about 30 minutes ago. And as you can see behind me, dawn is breaking. Right overhead, right over my hat, is actually the lighthouse here at Chatham, Mass. That was breaking the darkness all night long. We have had sporadic power outages, nothing real widespread here on the mainland, but the news is not near as good out on Nantucket. No power whatsoever. There's a lot of trees down, and there's also a fair amount of water now starting to flood some of the harbor area. And by the way, Cheryl, to my right is Nantucket Sound. The island of Nantucket would be about 20 miles due south of here.
Bill, this is a big holiday weekend. Have you found some folks kind of like packing it in early and only having a 2-day holiday as opposed to a 3-day holiday?
Oh yeah, very, very much so. We had a 25-mile tie-up yesterday afternoon, Cheryl. 25-mile backup on Highway 6 heading westbound over the Sagamore Bridge. There are really two main routes out off of the Cape. One would be Highway 6, the other Route 28, and Highway 6 is the main one, and the traffic tie-up was just astronomical. I came through about 8 o'clock last night, and even then there was about a 9-mile tie-up at that time. I want to mention one other thing. You talked about the storm surge, and it is a problem, not as much here at Nantucket Sound as our wind is pushing the water on out, but over the Cape Cod Bay area, that is a concern. The last tide was about 3:30 this morning, but it wasn't that bad. They said the tides ran about 2 to 3 feet above normal, but it looks like with the hurricane slowing down, we may have to deal with another high tide of concern at about 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Thanks, Bill. We appreciate the update, and we'll be checking back with you periodically throughout the morning hours. Well, also with us this morning, we have our very own senior meteorologist, Jim Wilson. And Jim, what I find so unusual about this hurricane is that hurricanes like to feed off of very warm waters, and the water temperatures are very cool around New England. So
yeah, it's very unusual. We see this storm, the pressure last recon actually saw the pressure drop in the middle. So even though it's over colder water, I think it's beginning to take on a little extra tropical characteristics, and it continues to deepen. So we'll say this storm will hold its own for the next 12 hours or so as it begins to move towards Nova Scotia as it rounds around the Cape. One other interesting point that Bill said, in the last big hurricane we had in this region was Hurricane Bob in 1991, and I think with the results of that, people are really heeding the warnings and getting out of there, and that's probably good. But the good news with this hurricane is it's much different than Bob, is that it's only a Category 1 storm, so it's minimal hurricane as it rounds the outer part of the Cape. So the outer part of the Cape, the Elbow, Cape, Provincetown, down through the eastern area, that's where the worst of the storm winds will be, and we're expecting about 75 miles per hour in gusts, especially to about 1 o'clock p.m., and then the storm begins to move away. The good thing we see on the satellite is that there's a strong band of winds across the Canadian border, and as it moves a little further northward, we'll begin to get into that winds and then get ripped out towards Nova Scotia later tonight. So once it gets in those winds, it'll really take off.
And you were making a comment earlier comparing this hurricane with possible nor'easters that we've had in the past, and how is the comparison with that?
Well, I'm a hardy New Englander, and so what I see on the map right now looks pretty much like a nor'easter, and the winds we're seeing are very, reminiscent of a very strong nor'easter. So this region of the country can take some strong winds to about hurricane force, and you get above 75 miles per hour, though, then you run into the trouble. The difference that it would be in a nor'easter, though, is that the trees still have their leaves on this time of year, and so that's the big concern, is that the trees may come down in the strong winds and affect the power. As Bill already said, the power is out pretty much in a lot of part of that the country because of that.
Right.
That's the difference between a nor'easter and this storm, is that the leaves are still there, and that's the reason why we're having the problems with power, I think.
Yeah, and probably the worst is yet to come, maybe about 3 o'clock or so this afternoon, around the time of high tide.
I would say the next 6 hours or so, as the storm begins to move up along the Cape Cod area, that the winds will continue to plow water into the north-facing beaches, especially around Barnstable Harbor and that place there, and the high tides are around 3 p.m., so we expect the problems with tides are not over yet. I think the next tide that comes around could be the worst of the tides, with storm surges like 3 to 6 feet, maybe as much as 8 feet in that Barnstable Harbor area.
Okay, thanks, Jim. We appreciate the update. Well, Hurricane Edouard's not the only story that we have to talk about today. Let's go back to the studios. We'll check out the weather across the rest of the country with Marshall.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks, Jim. That's right. We have Fran out in the Atlantic,
And right in the midst of all that nasty weather, we have our very own Bill Keneally. He's been up in Chatham, Massachusetts. Bill, can you give us an update about the latest weather conditions right now for Chatham?
Well, Cheryl, safe to say it's not your prototype Labor Day weekend weather here out in the Cape. You mentioned yesterday people making a mass exodus. They call it the Great Cape Escape. And at times there was a 25-mile backup. 25-mile backup to the Sagamore Bridge heading west on Route 6. My cameraman Jason is panning out now towards the water and looking beyond that gazebo. You can see those trees are really starting to get whacked by that wind. The wind is now from the north, and that is gusting as high. We're estimating now 60 to maybe 65 miles per hour. It is starting to turn a little more now north to maybe north-northwest. That's probably good news, telling us that the center very likely will pass just to our east. But Cheryl, we're as far south and east as one can get on Cape Cod, with the Chatham Lighthouse just behind that building behind me.
You were talking about the trees in the background and the full foliage. How much of an impact has that had on the weather?
Not too bad so far. You mentioned the trees do have a lot of leaves on them, so it is weighting them down some. There's also been a lot of rain overnight. I would say this had to be 3 or 4 inches of rain so far. But August had been fairly dry, so I don't think the soil is that saturated. And being as it is sandy, it is rather porous, so the trees are not being taken down by the saturated soil as much as just that unrelenting north wind. And you mentioned hurricane force winds now on Nantucket Island. Behind me is Nantucket Sound, and Nantucket Island's about 20 miles due south of here.
How extensive has some of the power outages been around that general area?
Not too bad here at the hotel. We've had some flickering in the past hour. Now, we stayed at a hotel about a mile away, getting pretty gusty right now, and we had power out for a couple of hours between around 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. But we haven't had any reports of widespread outages on Cape Cod, and even around Nantucket in the past hour they've gotten quite a bit of power back. But again, now getting some hurricane force winds out there.
Okay, thanks, Bill. We appreciate you weathering the storm for us. We'll be checking back with you probably in the next 30 minutes or so keep it tuned. Now, also with us live in the studio, we have our very own Jim Wilson, and he's a senior meteorologist here. And Jim, what I find so unusual about this hurricane is that the water temperatures are so cool around New England, and yet this hurricane has been able to maintain itself.
Yeah, very unusual. We've had a persistent trough in the eastern half of the nation, and the temps are a little cooler than they normally would be. They're in about the mid-60s around the Cape, and in 70 where the hurricane is now. So, yeah, it's very unusual for the storm to continue to hold its stead. The recon did find 960 millibars. In fact, the pressure went down a little bit, so I think there's a little bit of the cold core working its way in there, maybe interacting and allowing it to deepen a little bit. But it is unusual to see the thing deepen with cooler water.
We were talking about the high tide, too. One high tide this morning was around 3 o'clock this morning, but there's another high tide later this afternoon. And What can we expect during that time?
Well, I'm really concerned about Barnstable Harbor, which is in the north-facing area where the winds are driving into the south of Cape Cod Bay. The storm is supposed to go around the outer Cape around 1 p.m., and as the winds continue to drive in, there'll be another high tide, and I expect the storm surge to probably be the worst there. At 3 a.m., we saw like 2 to 3 feet, and it wasn't